Okay, welcome to the third offering in the History, Culture, and Diversity series this semester. I'm Dr. Robert Brown, Professor of History here and organizer of the series. We'll be recording today's program and uploading it to YouTube shortly for the benefit of those who are not able to join us today. And for those of you who are in the audience, if you could take a moment to sign the roster that will be making the rounds momentarily and indicating in what capacity you are attending the event today. I'm particularly enthused about our event today because it truly encapsulates the History, Culture, and Diversity mission and models two pillars of the series. Firstly, that of interdepartmental and institution-wide collaboration. Today's event is the product of a multitude of fruitful conversations and interactions between faculty and personnel across the college, from the English department, where the idea of recruiting Dr. Tulowiecki originated. Is Derek Gentry here in the audience? My hat's off to him for that. The organizational efforts of the Social Science Department and the Department of Environmental Conservation, the logistical assistance provided by the offices of Public Relations and Information Technology, and of course the financial support of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. The second History, Culture, and Diversity pillar exemplified by today's event is multi-perspectivalism and the demonstrable value of adopting a multidisciplinary approach to answer the age-old question, how did things get to be this way? Environmental scientist William Cronin, one of the inspirations for today's talk, posed this very question in a 2013 UC Berkeley interview when discussing the genesis of his landmark book, Changes in the Land. Dr. Cronin's work and that of our distinguished speaker today are compelling validations of the multidisciplinary model and how the interconnection or intersection of diverse perspectives offered by discrete fields like history, ecology, anthropology, environmental science, and geography can clarify our worldview, three-dimensionalize our understanding of contemporary issues and existential challenges, and guide our decision-making about a sustainable future. To properly introduce our speaker, Dr. Stephen Tulowiecki, I'd like to invite his disciplinary colleague, Dr. Bruce Gilman, to the lectern. For those of you who don't know Dr. Gilman, he's a 42-year pedagogical veteran of this institution. He is Professor Emeritus of Environmental Conservation at FLCC and former director of both the Environmental Studies program and the Mueller Field Station. Dr. Gilman, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. When studying nature, and in particular the nature of forest communities, one often thinks about the complex of environmental factors that affect the composition of a forest. Is there something different about the soil in an area that favors a particular tree species? What role might slope of the land or compass orientation to sunlight be playing? How significant are weather conditions, things like the length of growing season, summer temperatures, annual precipitation, and the possible effects of wind? One can easily design a field study that could collect data on those conditions. But wait, there's another important determinant of forest composition that may not receive the attention that it deserves, and that is time. What has happened in the past may be reflected in what we observe in the composition of the forest today. Similarly, if an historic condition no longer occurs today, how would that change the nature of our modern forest? Our guest presenter today is an associate professor of geography and sustainability studies at SUNY Geneseo. He will be sharing his intellectual curiosity and research concerning past forest conditions in eastern North America, especially the possible role of indigenous peoples' land management techniques. The central question that he'll be addressing: did widespread cultural burning maintain oak and other fire-adapted species? This would be, of course, in the pre-European settlement forests of our region. His findings, his historic perspective, is relevant today as our Appalachian oak hickory forests are failing to regenerate, raising significant ecological and economic concerns. One needs to understand the drivers of oak forest dynamics to manage these forests sustainably for future generations. Join me in welcoming Professor Steve Tulowiecki.
Okay, so thank you for that wonderful introduction, both of you. Just to get a feel for the room, how many of you in here are students? How many of you are faculty or staff? How about just other members of the community? How many students are here purely out of curiosity and enjoyment today? How many of you are here for extra credit? Okay, so I'm hoping it'll be a nice, enjoyable extra credit assignment to write your reflective assignment, I imagine, on this talk. Also, I should mention I'm on sabbatical this semester. I'm teaching no classes. This is like the only class I'm teaching this entire semester to students. So thank you once again for inviting me. My talk is Oak Forests as Indigenous Land Legacies, Native American Culture and the Sustainability of Eastern Oak Forests. This lecture is, quote, a dynamic interdisciplinary project designed to widen students' perspectives on cultural and social issues. I'm a physical geographer by training, but here in this lecture I will connect my research to the ideals of this lecture series in many ways. I hope to widen your perspective on how indigenous cultures have utilized landscapes sustainably. I will show you how applying traditional indigenous land management to forests can yield both ecological and economic benefits. And today's topic is interdisciplinary, as Robert mentioned, weaving together geography, ecology, history, anthropology, and forestry. My talk has 5 parts. First, I will introduce the oak tree, its economic importance, and problems it faces in the eastern U.S. Second, I cover how indigenous societies, Native Americans, promoted oak forests, woodlands, and savannas using fire. Third, I summarize approaches to studying past oak landscapes and inferring connections to indigenous land use. Fourth, I cover studies that assess the importance of indigenous land use, namely fire, to maintaining oak landscapes. And fifth, I assess whether current fire science confirms the benefits of indigenous cultural burning to oak landscapes today. First, what is happening in forests of the eastern U.S. today? First, an introduction into oak as a genus. Oak is a foundational tree genus comprised of 50 tree species in the eastern U.S. Historically, it was the most abundant tree genus east of the Mississippi River. On this map, darker green indicates higher oak biodiversity. Some locations in the eastern U.S. contained as many as 20 unique oak species. In the Finger Lakes region, 3 oak species predominated, and they are pictured here. They are white oak, red oak, and black oak. Other oaks locally included bur oak, swamp white oak, chestnut oak, and chinkapin oak. So this is a very diverse genus, even in our own region. Out of these 3, white oak especially holds high cultural, ecological, and economic value. Pictured here are the open-grown and closed-grown forms of white oak, as well as its acorns and autumn foliage. Oak landscapes were and are ecologically important to indigenous societies. Acorns were harvested and processed as food by indigenous peoples. Oak savannas and woodlands, defined as open ecosystems with low-density tree cover with a mixture of herbaceous plants, including grasses, were productive ecosystems that sustained game like white-tailed deer. There were obvious reasons why indigenous cultures would manage forests to promote these open oak ecosystems, which I will cover later. Oak ecosystems also provide many ecological benefits. Oak savannas and woodlands are particularly biodiverse, hosting rare wildflowers, grasses, insects, birds, and mammals. Moreover, oaks are a valuable building material for furniture, fencing, baskets, and barrels. White oak specifically exports total roughly $500 million per year. Kentucky bourbon, which relies upon white oak barrels that lend its distinctive flavor, generates around $9 billion in revenue per year. However, for the last 100 years, oak has declined. It was one of the most important trees in the eastern U.S., but now it is not replacing itself. It is not regenerating, in other words. Fire-tolerant and shade-sensitive trees like oak and hickory have decreased, and fire-sensitive and shade-tolerant trees like maple have increased. This process has been termed mesophication. You may wonder how trees like oak can tolerate fire. I will cover that later. Mesophication is also generally associated with an increase in tree density within forests and a loss of semi-forested ecosystems like woodlands, savannas, and barrens. On the slide are the 10 most common tree genera in the eastern U.S. and whether they are increasing or decreasing. Notice that maple is the biggest increaser, whereas oak is the biggest decreaser. Also shown are maps for each of these 10 genera. Red indicates loss, whereas green indicates increase. Notice how much red appears in the map for the geographic range of oak, or quercus, which is there in the bottom right portion of this slide. This graph shows acres of white oak-dominated forests per age class for a 6-state region. Age is on the bottom axis, and acreage is on the left axis. Notice how the most common age classes for oak are from 51 to 90 years, but young white oak forests are infrequent, as seen on the left-hand side of this slide. Oak failure is also occurring within our region. Here's a 60-year-old photo showing a large white oak amidst younger beech and sugar maple along the Geneseo River near Rochester. Given the multifaceted importance of oak, people have become concerned about its decline. Researchers in geography, forestry, and forest ecology are investigating factors contributing to this decline. There are many hypotheses, and there is much debate about which factors contributed to its historical abundance and recent failure. These graphs illustrate basic changes to eastern forests and their potential causes. The top graph shows the abundance of 2 key trees, oak and maple, from 1750 to the present day. We see a 20th century decrease of oak and an increase in maple. Researchers have often offered many possible causes of oak failure in the eastern U.S., of which 4 are illustrated here. First, climate change. Oak is thought to be a drought-tolerant tree. It can tolerate long periods of dryness. But with 20th century global warming, we've actually seen a decrease in drought and an increase in prolonged wet conditions known as pluvials. Without drought, other trees may outcompete oak. However, this interpretation is being challenged by new research suggesting that oak is not as drought tolerant as once thought. Second, changing wildlife populations. The passenger pigeon has gone extinct, a species so numerous that flocks of roosting birds would break branches and create forest gaps of sunlight that benefited oak seedlings. The resurgence of turkey that consume acorns and deer that preferentially eat acorns and oak seedlings also harm oak regeneration. Third, deforestation and reforestation. In the 19th and 20th centuries, swaths of land were logged or farmed. After land abandonment, succession occurred and lands reverted to forest. This process benefited trees like maple that can colonize lands via wind dispersal and tolerate many environmental conditions, compared to oak that has heavy animal dispersed seeds. And finally, changing fire regimes. Historically, eastern forests experienced low-intensity fires until the mid-19th century. From the mid-19th to early 20th century, there were large destructive fires caused by coal-fired steam engines and the logging industry. And since then, a policy of fire exclusion has dominated, eliminating fire from forests. The loss of fire has harmed oak regeneration because oak possesses adaptations that allow it to survive and thrive in areas with low-intensity, semi-frequent fires. Oaks have deep root systems and root collar buds below ground, which allow the tree to regrow after top kill or injury from fire. Their bark is thick and insulating, protecting it from heat. They can rapidly close fire wounds. And finally, oak flames are highly flammable, suggesting that oak evolved to promote fire to kill neighboring species. Here's a white oak after a fire with a burn injury on its trunk. The absence of fire is emerging as a top reason why oaks are not regenerating in eastern forests. However, if fire sustained oak forests, then what or who was the ignition source? As shown in these photos from a forest fire in Minnewaska State Park, lightning can start forest fires. However, in the humid eastern U.S., lightning ignitions are rare. According to DEC data, only 5% of fires were caused by lightning from 1993 to 2017 in New York State. How then did historic forests burn, including before Europeans? The answer is cultural burning by Native Americans. In this next part, I dive deeper into the use of indigenous cultural burning by addressing the question, how did Native Americans promote oak landscapes through fire? Indigenous societies use many strategies to boost the productivity and the predictability of landscapes. Here are 6 strategies, of which I highlight 3 that are most relevant to our talk. Native Americans perform general modifications of vegetation communities. For example, clearing forests to build towns and plant fields. Second, in-place encouragement of fruit and nut-bearing tree species. What does this mean? It means they found preferred fruit or nut trees and promoted their growth by clearing undesirable trees around them. And finally, landscape modification to increase prey abundance in specific locations. For example, creating or maintaining habitat for deer. I call attention to 2 land use practices that Native Americans used. Clearing for villages and horticulture is number 1. Here's an example from the Mohawk territory of eastern New York State, circa 1500. And here, burning to clear land, ease travel, benefit hunting, and promote favored plants. Here we see an example of a modern-day controlled burn in an oak savanna. Burning would create open grassy environments to attract animals like deer. Clearance would make spotting deer from long distance easier. Fire was also a tactical tool used for corralling game into areas where they could be more easily killed. Here's another example of the differences in forest structure between burned and unburned forests from Missouri. Notice the open quality on the left photo. This is a photo that has been subjected to routine low-intensity burns. Edible plants also thrive in sunny environments created by fire, such as oak, hickory, blueberries, and strawberries in our region. Pictured here are oak acorns, chestnuts, and hickory nuts. Here's a video of a fire along Canadice Lake to our west in 2023, showing what these fires might have looked like. Native Americans utilized low-severity, frequent fires that would burn away grasses, woody debris, and small trees, but leave behind larger trees. Cultural burns were not the massive fires that leveled forests like what we see in the western U.S. today. As a geographer, I'm interested in the geography of cultural fire. In what terrain and climate would burning occur? What is the extent of Native American impacts to forests? Were they localized or widespread? Was it enough to maintain oak forests throughout the eastern U.S.? This diagram suggests that indigenous burning would occur on more upland sites, away from moist bottomlands and swamps, especially on dry, sun-facing slopes. Lighter yellow shading indicates drier environments with fire on this diagram, and the spacing of trees shows the low density of upland forests, perhaps maintained through fire. Here is an idealized map of Native American land use. In the center is a village with clearings and fields. Surrounding the town are burned areas, and farther away are larger burned grasslands created for hunting. This map is only an estimation, and it suggests that fire use occurred within 5 to 10 miles of a village, but others would argue for more wide-ranging impacts. This map shows estimated Native American population circa 1500. Darker colors indicate higher population densities. Researchers have estimated that there were 1 to 2 million people living in eastern North America circa 1500, though some estimates are even higher. Now imagine superimposing those estimated impacts from the last map upon this map, with more impacts in the higher density areas and impacts occurring around settlements in locations warm and dry enough to support it. Perhaps those impacts would be substantial and observable across a regional or even continental extent. And perhaps indigenous burning sustained the historical dominance of oaks across the eastern U.S. Not only do researchers debate the importance of indigenous land use to oak landscapes, there's also been much debate over what the Americas looked like upon European arrival, as illustrated by these two debating quotes, both from 1991. Some scholars believe that 16th century America was still the first Eden that was pristine and natural, and that indigenous people were transparent in the landscape. On the other hand, others believe that America was a humanized landscape almost everywhere, with soil erosion, burned areas, areas for clearing, etc. This debate continues into present day, even between Ivy League institutions like Harvard and renowned geography programs like Penn State. The former claiming that ecology was driven by climate, and the latter claiming that eastern forests were shaped more by burning than climate change. While the last two sections of this talk introduce problems facing oak and the roles of indigenous cultural burning in maintaining oaks, I now answer this question. How do researchers study historical oak landscapes and their connections to indigenous land use? This pursuit is inherently difficult. Native Americans were dispossessed of the land from 150 to 400 years ago, and specifically from the 1790s to 1820s in our region. Native Americans managed the land for thousands of years. We do not have structured data from a time when they controlled the land. We have to rely on historical records and physical proxies of land use, gathering evidence like detectives to map and understand Native American settlement and forest conditions. Consulting Native Americans today, the keepers of traditional ecological knowledge, is one way to understand. However, that knowledge is not always easily accessible, particularly in the eastern U.S. One method for understanding forest changes over time is through paleoecological methods, including palynology. Palynology is the study of fossil pollen. Scientists collect sediments from the bottom of ponds and lakes where pollen accumulates in annual layers. Scientists then date material in sediment layers and count pollen spores in other material, including charcoal. They then graph changes over thousands of years in the amounts of these materials, comparing them to indigenous settlement and climate data. Scientists can then plot changes in tree composition and charcoal frequency. Here is an example study from southern Ontario, Canada. This map shows the density of archaeological sites as different shades of black and gray, and the locations also of these palynology sites, in other words, lakes and ponds where sediments were taken for analysis. On this graph, time from oldest to most recent is on the left axis, and pollen percentages are on the bottom axis. Researchers found increases in oak, quercus, pine, pinus, grasses, as well as cultivated crops or cultigens with the arrival of Native Americans, coincided with increases in fire as recorded by charcoal. What I've shown here with these four arrows are all increasing values, right, for once again from left to right, cultivated crops, grasses, oak, and then pine. So we see with the arrival of Native Americans, those four groupings of species all tend to increase. While these records are valuable, they have limitations. Water bodies capable of producing adequate pollen records are rare. A water body collects airborne pollen from vegetation within a radius of only a few miles. And regarding charcoal, not all fires produce charcoal that could end up in a water body, particularly low-intensity fires that Native Americans lit. Another means of understanding is by reading accounts of explorers, travelers, and pioneers who described landscapes from the 16th to 19th centuries. Here is an account from 1 hour southwest of Canandaigua. It described Groveland Hill as being scatteringly covered with the different kinds of oak, and some places destitute of timber. It also describes openings that grew up to a tall grass which was burnt over every fall by the Indians. These accounts potentially have bias and error, and it can be challenging to determine locations observed. However, my research has found that these accounts are useful and accurate, and that they agree with other historical sources, which I will cover later. Moreover, my current research involves cataloging and mapping such accounts. Yet another method is dendrochronology, the study of annual growth of tree rings. Scientists study tree rings to understand if trees started growing in open conditions or if trees experienced years with increasing growth rates, both of which suggest thinning of forest by cultural burning. Moreover, scientists study cross-sections of fire-scarred trees to determine the dates and even the seasonality of fires. On the top are examples of fire-scarred trees, and on the bottom are cross-sections showing tree rings with fire scars labeled. Using these trees, studies have found that fires occurred as frequently as every 3 to 6 years in oak forests, during seasons when lightning is rare, suggesting humans were burning. One recent study from north central Pennsylvania even found fire-scarred pine stumps dating to 1400. Fire-scarred trees are a valuable record of past cultural burning. However, old trees are rare. Records have been developed in only about 200 locations in eastern North America, and many records do not stretch back to Native American occupation. In 2023, collaborators and I related the number of fires between 1701 and 1750 recorded in fire-scarred trees with environmental conditions in Native American geography in central Pennsylvania. We found meaningful relationships between fire frequency and proximity to Native American towns and trails. Fires were more common near towns and trails, but also in warmer and windier areas with less complex terrain. Here are 3D graphs describing the relationships between fire, temperature, and distance to towns or trails. And the map shows areas of predicted higher or lower fire frequency, along with indigenous villages and trails. For reference, this map also shows the locations of Williamsport, State College, and Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Finally, we have land survey records. Before the sale and settlement of lands by European Americans, land surveyors, like the one pictured here, were tasked with surveying the land. They would record landscape conditions, including tree species, soil types, and terrain features. On some occasions, they would even record Native American trails, burned areas, or thinly timbered areas. Though these records also possess error and bias, they are an invaluable record of landscape conditions just before white settlement, and they allow researchers to map what forests look like and how they may have been used by Native Americans. Surveyors recorded observations in field notes. Here is one example page of field notes from a survey in Chautauqua County, New York, in 1804. Surveyors recorded many types of data. They first recorded where they were and where they were traveling, information like the township range and lot number and the direction and distance that they were traveling. Crucially, however, they also recorded what are called witness trees. These were the trees that were marked as survey monuments at town or lot corners. In the middle of the wilderness, the most valuable survey monuments were trees. They would mark these trees at every corner so that settlers could find the corner of their future property. They would then record the species and other data on that tree. Here, the surveyor used 2 maple trees as monuments at the south end of this survey line, which is the top of the page, and 2 beech trees at the north end, which is the bottom of this page. Moreover, land surveyors recorded timber descriptions, which were lists of tree species observed along a survey line. This surveyor traveled north through an upland with butternut, white ash, and sugar maple. He then crossed a swamp with birch and black ash. Finally, he entered another upland with soft maple, basswood, and elm, and then finally another upland with hickory, chestnut, and white oak and black oak. Several studies have used these survey records to understand relationships between forests and indigenous settlement. For example, here's a study from 1830s Green Bay, Wisconsin. I circle in red the V symbol indicating villages, and I trace in green oak savannas that were mapped from land survey records. Notice the correlation. These researchers also investigated climate and soil conditions here, finding that oak savannas could not be explained by environmental conditions, suggesting that Native Americans maintained them via fire. Here's a 1990s study from closer to Canandaigua. This was a study of forest communities of the Phelps and Gorham Purchase around 1790. This was a large tract of land that included the western Finger Lakes. In this map, I circled Canandaigua Lake for reference. Also, the survey lines are black, and the inset map shows where this Phelps and Gorham Purchase was located within the state. This survey typically established 6 by 6 mile towns. This study's author from RIT transcribed field notes to understand the distribution of tree species in forest communities. Here is one page of field notes stored at the Ontario County Historical Society, just up the road in Canandaigua, describing the survey line between the towns of Canandaigua on the north and Bristol on the south. Underlined in red are locational descriptions. The surveyor even mentions survey corners and Canandaigua Lake, which was the misspelling of Canandaigua Lake. And underlined in green are tree species. This surveyor marked black and white oak as being present, along with hickory, chestnut, maple, beech, ash, elm, basswood, butternut, and white pine. Once this researcher transcribed and mapped these notes, he applied statistical clustering techniques to determine which species tended to be mentioned together by the surveyors. This analysis found 7 major forest communities. This is a diagram called a dendrogram, which shows the similarity among communities. The farther right that the 2 branches split, the less similar the communities are, whereas the farther left they split, the more similar they are. Around Canandaigua, 2 basic communities were oak, chestnut, hickory forests and beech maple forests. These are communities found in drier versus moister conditions, respectively. This diagram further broke down communities into different subtypes. This map shows the locations of those communities circa 1790. The number 2, it's hard to read, I imagine, indicates communities of black oak, white oak, and hickory. And notice that these forests were extensive. For scale, most square towns shown on this map are 6 by 6 miles. These forests are also potentially those burned by the Seneca and Cayuga peoples who inhabited and still inhabit this area. 5, the number 5 indicates the driest sites with chestnut, white oak, and chestnut oak, also possibly burned, but also droughty environments. And the number 1 indicates those beech maple forests, which were not likely subjected to fire. A more recent study combined surveyor descriptions of tree species with other descriptions from those survey records to map landscapes. They also applied these clustering methods to see which kinds of surveyor language was grouped together, and they also produced this dendrogram chart. I put this in here only to emphasize that surveyors not only described tree species, but they also did note burnt timber, corresponding with other types of fire-tolerant vegetation communities, communities with oak and pine, as well as grasslands. In the eastern Finger Lakes, a similar study was performed, yielding roughly the same results regarding forest communities. We saw the same breakdown between the beech maple and oak hickory forest types. On this map, which is somewhat hard to read, the dashes are beech maple forests, but more importantly for this talk, the white squares are those oak hickory forests, and then the black squares are a mix of those 2 communities. What I have done in this map is I've highlighted in red those larger patches of oak hickory forests, which are perhaps those that were managed by fire by the Cayuga and Onondaga peoples of the eastern Finger Lakes. In another study, researchers tallied witness trees of each species in towns across the northeastern U.S. Recall that witness trees are trees that surveyors marked as town or lot corners. By tallying the number of each type of tree, they estimated which trees were most common. This map shows the northeastern U.S. Each circle or pie chart shows the percentage of each tree species found in one town. For example, the dark red is beech, found often in the north, and the gold is oak, found often in the south. On the right are percentages of trees circa 1790 in the town of Naples. This is recording the relative abundance, in other words, the percentage of all trees that were of a given species. According to these tallies, over half of trees were oaks. Chestnut was the most common, and maple and pine were tied for the third most common. Using these data, other researchers have applied statistical techniques to estimate tree species abundance across the region, filling in the gaps seen in this map. Scientists estimate that oak was the most abundant in our region. Surveyors did not always record the exact species, but white oak, black oak, chestnut oak, and red oak would have been common. The Western Finger Lakes were heavily oak, often comprising over half of all trees. Its ability to tolerate drought and indigenous cultural burning contributed to its success in the region. While previous studies found geographical correspondence between indigenous settlement and oak forests, few studies have attempted to separate environmental from human factors shaping past oak distribution. In this section, I summarize studies that sought to assess the relative importance of indigenous land management, namely fire, in sustaining oak landscapes. Here is one study from northwestern Pennsylvania. In this map, I circle Native American villages in red and trace with green the general area where oak, hickory, and chestnut were observed in survey records around 1800. Those are the black squares. Notice the correlation once again between villages and these tree species, all three of which can thrive in open, burned environments and which provide large nut crops. These researchers performed a statistical analysis of this pattern, comparing this forest pattern to terrain conditions, soil conditions, and distance to indigenous villages. They found that these tree species were found near Native American settlement as quantified by a Native American Index, or NAI, atop certain bedrock geology types, and upon mid to upper slopes. Results suggest that the distribution of these trees was shaped by indigenous land use, but also by terrain and geology. Moreover, this paper aligns with this diagram that I showed you previously, suggesting that oak was located in more upland areas near Native American settlement, where cultural burns were more likely to occur. My own research has used surveyor observations of oaks to assess correlations with Native American settlement. In this 2015 study from Chautauqua County in southwestern New York, I studied tree patterns that surveyors recorded around 1800 and its relationship to Native American settlement that had ceased just a few years prior. We used a set of quantitative techniques referred to as species distribution modeling. These models input species presence and absence locations, compare these records to underlying variables such as soil, climate, or distance to settlement, determine relationships between species and these variables, and then generate a prediction across space representing the species range. They also generate graphs showing the relationships between a species and each variable, and measures of each variable's importance. Our study found that the distribution of fire-tolerant trees, including white oak, shown here, was most influenced by Native Americans, more so than environmental conditions. Here's the distribution of white oak in Chautauqua County circa 1800. The thin gray lines are survey lines, the thick black lines show where surveyors observed white oak, and the large black dots indicate where surveyors marked white oak at lot corners. Purple triangles show the locations of 18th century Seneca Haudenosaunee towns. Notice once again the correlation. It is particularly difficult to explain white oak presence around Chautauqua Lake in the middle of this map based upon environmental conditions alone. The effects of Native American land use, possibly burning, radiated outward about 6 to 9 miles from towns. In a 2020 study, collaborators and I studied the late 18th century distribution of oak savannas in western New York. Across North America, oak savannas were largely controlled by Native American fire, but were also found in drier climates or atop soils that could not retain moisture. When we hear the word savanna, we may think of Africa, but a savanna is any ecosystem typified by grasses and widely spaced trees. Oak savannas were once much more common in the eastern U.S., including in western and central New York, but are now considered a globally endangered ecosystem, with less than 1% remaining. Oak savannas existed in the region, but their distribution and the full factors contributing to their distribution are not fully known. From 2018 to 2020, my collaborators, student assistants, and I searched for descriptions of oak savannas in surveyor field notes. This page describes the 6-mile line between Henrietta and Rush to our northwest, around 1795. As we started reading these notes, we noticed descriptions of thinly timbered areas with oak, shown here. The phrase thinly timbered is a code for widely spaced trees within oak savannas. One surveyor described thinly timbered oak landscapes atop gravelly soil, suggesting that oak formed oak savannas because gravelly soils would be drier and would support drought-tolerant species like oak and grasses. So where did surveyors observe and record oak savannas in the 1790s? Once again, here is a map of western New York and the Western Finger Lakes, and I've circled once again Canandaigua in red for you. This map shows survey lines in black and oak savannas in red highlights. Also on this map are 18th century Native American towns as black dots. Our research estimated that about 4% of western New York was oak savannas around 1800. We see some association between Native American towns and oak savannas in some areas, suggesting that Native Americans were setting fire to oak savannas. This relationship is seen in the Middle Genesee Valley, a region that was the 18th century center of Seneca and mixed ethnicity towns. However, in other places, we have Native American towns but no oak savannas, and sometimes we have oak savannas but no Native American towns. So what we did is we performed a rigorous statistical analysis of oak savanna locations to assess whether cultural burning, climate, soil, or some combination of factors shape the distribution seen here. We again employed models. Here is the same diagram showing how modeling works. We compared presence and absence locations of oak savannas to underlying data layers in a geographic information system. Then, via modeling techniques, we determined which factors best predicted oak savannas and the nature of the relationships between oak savannas and these factors. One variable was simply distance to Native American towns. The final models then made a continuous prediction of oak savannas across the region. We found that oak savanna distribution was roughly equally the product of human and environmental factors. Listed here are the most important factors. Notice that proximity to nearest Native American town was second most important. But notice that oak savannas were also located in the warmest and driest portions of our region. Results suggest that Native Americans had close knowledge of the land, focusing their fires at locations that could support it, warm, less rainy areas with drier soils. This map shows oak savanna locations predicted by models based on relationships in the previous slide. Darker red shows where oak savannas were more probable. This map looks similar to the map of surveyor observations, but notice that it fills in areas where there were no surveyor field notes. Notice the belt of oak savannas stretching from Letchworth State Park in the south to Rush Henrietta in the north, almost to Rochester. The model also predicts a moderate probability of oak savannas around Canandaigua Lake. There were indigenous towns at both ends of Canandaigua Lake near upland locations conducive to fire. However, we didn't stop here. We wanted another means of verifying our predictions independent of the surveyor field notes and model results. We sought out descriptions of landscapes first encountered by white settlers, recorded in other historical documents such as county histories and travel journals. We wrote programming code to have computers read digitized historical texts to isolate passages that described early landscape conditions. What we found confirmed our model predictions. Many descriptions from early settlers and historians mentioned low-density forests with oak and sometimes even burned areas. Here are some examples from locations near Canandaigua Lake. Canandaigua, Cheshire, Bristol, and Naples all contain descriptions of thinly timbered oak woodlands or savannas, and some of them even mentioned explicitly that indigenous people were burning or had burned the area just prior to white settlement. So we see a lot of those descriptions of burning in order to create deer habitat. We also see descriptions of areas without trees. We even see that thinly timbered description once again. Now, to combine it all, this map shows the modeled oak savannas in red, Native American towns as black dots, and historical descriptions as plus signs, as seen there on the previous slide. Note the correspondence between oak savanna predictions and historical descriptions of burned and or open oak landscapes. We therefore verified the accuracy of the model, giving greater confidence regarding historical oak savanna locations. Note, for instance, that while surveyors didn't record observations of oak savannas on the Tonawanda Reservation, we did see high model predictions, and we also did see a lot of historical accounts from that area of oak savannas and burned landscapes. Through this procedure, we gained greater confidence of the importance of Native American cultural burning in maintaining this rare ecosystem. These results more broadly show us that our region was not one vast forest and that humans had managed the land. It also shows us that some rare ecosystems are actually dependent upon human intervention to maintain them. Moreover, it speaks to the antiquity of human-environment relationships. Some oak savannas were maintained likely over hundreds or thousands of years by fire, only to disappear once fire was exploded upon European American arrival. Savannas mapped here are virtually non-existent today. As important as these studies were, they examined the relationship between Native American settlement and vegetation in small geographic areas. But what were impacts on past oak forests at larger extents? In a 2022 study with 4 undergraduate researchers, we examined the relationship between Native American land use, forest patterns, and climate and soil conditions across the entire northeastern U.S. We relied on other researchers' data on past forest composition in the northeastern and midwestern U.S. They used land survey records also to estimate the relative abundance of 22 different trees. Here are their estimations. In these maps, greener indicates higher abundance. Grouping the northeastern and midwestern U.S. together, the most dominant trees were oak, beech, maple, and pine. And you can see there, more or less in the middle of this slide here, the distribution of oak showing just how abundant it was, many locations almost being completely oak species. We compared forest composition patterns to Native American settlement. Here's a map showing settlement areas circa 1500, notable archaeological sites circa 1500 to 1700, and town sites in the late 18th century. Again, we used modeling to compare species patterns with soil, climate, and Native American settlement. These studies' findings were fairly consistent with my previous work. The models suggest that Native Americans influenced forest patterns within about 12 miles of settlement. We see increases in fire-tolerant and or edible trees, as well as early successional trees that thrive in open, disturbed environments like ash. However, models suggested that at the regional extent of the northeastern U.S., climate and soil conditions, specifically annual temperature and soil pH, also had great influence on tree species patterns. Combined with previous findings, indigenous influence upon forests was detectable when you look at historical data at fine resolution and at small geographic extents. But once you zoom out to the regional extent, the impact becomes constrained by other variables, especially temperature. In the 5th and final part of this talk, I conclude by connecting forest historical research with forest management today. Does current experimental research support the idea that low to moderate intensity fire benefits oak? And does Western science agree with indigenous traditional ecological knowledge regarding the outcomes of cultural burning? The answer appears to be a resounding yes. Here I summarize one paper from 2021, but note that many studies link low-intensity fires to oak success. In this study from northeastern Connecticut, researchers studied forest changes over 20 years. A forest was subjected to an initial tree thinning and then 3 subsequent burns an average of 6 years apart. They compared these changes to unburned control forests. They found that burned forests filled in with oaks and hickories, whereas unburned forests filled in with fire-sensitive tree species like birch. These pictures show the burned forest immediately after fire and 2 months after fire. This chart shows the number of trees before thinning and clearing, and in 2006 and 2019 for burned and unburned forests. The warmer colors, meaning pink, orange, and yellow, are oak, hickory, and pine respectively, whereas cooler colors, specifically green, light blue, and dark blue, are ash, maple, and birch. We can see that especially in 2019, in the burned forest, that oak plus hickory makes up the majority of trees, and that there are overall fewer trees. Conversely, in 2019, in the unburned forest, there are more trees overall, and in especially higher percentages of fire-sensitive species like birch, and fewer oak and hickory. Other results from the study show that while burned forests had less total biomass than unburned forests, the trees in burned forests were larger on average. Burned forests also showed greater biodiversity in the understory. Studies like these confirm that low-intensity fires benefit oak, hickory, and pine by opening up forests to allow more light into the understory, and by creating a competitive advantage for fire-adapted species. Modern forest science is confirming that indigenous land management practices, namely burning, would have benefited these tree species, and proposes that fire can promote tree species preferred for timber production, like white oak, and for achieving certain ecological benefits, like higher biodiversity. In 2023, my collaborators and I published a study examining which tree species traits show the clearest changing trends between the larger, older trees in the canopy and smaller, younger trees in the understory. We visited forests within a 1-hour drive of Geneseo, including lands west and south of Canandaigua. With students, we collected data at 160 forest plots, assigned numeric scores to certain traits to these species, and then quantified the change in scores between canopy and understory trees. The changes from older to younger trees are listed here, from strongest change to weakest change. The species trait that showed the biggest change between older, larger, and younger, smaller trees was fire tolerance, followed by white-tailed deer browse preference, and interestingly, Native American dietary trees. Put together, this suggests that old canopy trees are generally species that are more fire tolerant, more sensitive to deer browsing, and more important as foraged foods. Conversely, trees in the understory are generally less fire tolerant, more resistant to deer browsing, and less edible. These results show that many factors cause changes in our forests, including but not limited to fire exclusion. Other factors like deer overpopulation are dramatically changing the composition of our forests. In conclusion, a few points are worth emphasizing. First, research collectively suggests that indigenous burning was an important factor in maintaining oak forests at local to regional extents. Second, my research continues to examine ecological legacies of indigenous land use. Some of these legacies may have even persisted into today. Some oak landscapes today might be cultural legacies. Pictured here are 3 members of the Seneca Nation, including my friend Ken Parker on the right, in a remnant oak savanna in Geneseo, New York, one that was described by land surveyors and observed by early white travelers. Some trees in this very area predate white settlement. And in Geneseo, we found one fallen 330-year-old white oak whose trunk revealed fire scars dating to the mid-1700s in an area that was formerly oak savanna. However, this remains our only physical evidence of fire within the Geneseo area. And finally, indigenous ecological knowledge deserves a seat at the table when managing forests today. Western science is revealing the value of indigenous land management, namely cultural burning, for maintaining healthy oak ecosystems. But we should not require that indigenous knowledge must always be validated by Western scientists like me. We should value both indigenous and Western knowledge to guide forest management. As this 2018 article stated, indigenous peoples don't need Western science to validate or legitimate their knowledge system. But some do appreciate the verification, and there are partnerships developing worldwide with indigenous knowledge holders and Western scientists working together to better manage forests. Thank you for your time. I'm happy to answer any questions, and if there's any students who want to continue their education, please feel free to chat with me about Geneseo afterwards, about educational opportunities and research chances as well. Thank you.